Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're just going to get started. I'm very glad to see so many people with us this morning. Thank you all. This morning, I'm very pleased to present our esteemed panel who are going to speak with us about economic policy during the last 20 years. As I think most of you know, this is the Program in Economic Policy Management 20-year anniversary, and we were very proud to have all of our former directors with us and many of our former faculty and many of our alumni and current students. Thank you all for coming, and I'll leave the panel to you, Professor Lukauskas.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. Do I have to turn this on? There we go. Okay. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces, and I hope to have a chance to catch up with everybody during the course of the day. As David said, the title of our panel is Key Economic Policy Issues in the Past 20 Years. And that's a pretty imposing task. So I both pity and envy my fellow panelists for having the chance to dig into such meaty topics. And thinking back over the last 20 years, indeed a lot has taken place. In the area of finance, we've had multiple crises, first in emerging markets, and then in the United States and other developed countries. And clearly, every time we pick up the newspaper today, the headlines are dominated by the crisis in Europe. And just in the academic sense, this term sudden stops that maybe a few of you PEPM students have heard once or twice has become common parlance in economic debates. In the area of trade, we had the completion of the interminable Uruguay round and the start of the interminable Doha round, which is still going on. In the area of global economic governance, we've seen a shift from the developed countries calling all the shots, perhaps in the context of the G7, to the G20 suddenly gaining importance and becoming the forum for most discussions concerning international economic policy issues. In the area of development, we've seen the rise of the BRICS, in particular the incredible rise of China, perhaps the biggest growth story of the last 200 years. And even sub-Saharan Africa, which suffered years of stagnation of slow growth, has begun to emerge as an area of sustainable growth in the world economy. And in the academic sense, we've seen the very interesting development of the explosion of interest in randomized controlled trials as a basis for formulating and thinking about development policies. Then finally, in macroeconomics, the Great Moderation unfortunately gave way to the Great Recession. Alan Greenspan went from being a deity to just a merely fallible economist like all the rest of us. And we've even seen the resurgence of traditional Keynesianism that finds its way basically almost every day on the pages of the New York Times through Paul Krugman and others. So indeed, these are very, very interesting times. And I can think of no better set of panelists to address these issues. The bios of all the panelists are included in the folders that you have. So let me just very briefly introduce each one, and you can read more about them in your brochures. The first panelist will be Juan Pablo Jimenez, who has the virtue of both being a PEPM alum and also having taught for PEPM for numerous years. A very interesting course on fiscal policy, decentralization in various parts of the world. Juan Pablo is an economics affairs officer in the Division of Economic Development in the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And among many areas of expertise, he's certainly a specialist in fiscal policy. Next, we have Michael Connelly, who was the second director of PEPM from 1994 to 1995. Michael is a professor of economics at the University of Miami School of Business and Administration, as well as a professor of finance at Hunan University in China. Michael is a specialist in international finance, as well as trade and development, So Michael, thank you very much for being here as well. And finally, we have Robert Mondell, who is a university professor at Columbia University. If you don't know the university, to be a university professor is indeed a rare honor. There are just a handful of university professors. So this is a very, very distinguished post. Robert is a Nobel laureate in economics from 1999. He's the father of many different areas of international economics, including optimum currency areas. And who among us has not used the Mundell-Fleming framework at some point in our careers in thinking about issues like exchange rates and fiscal policy and monetary policy? So each panelist will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and afterwards we'll have a question and answer period. So if they start to go past their 10 minutes, the audience can help out by beginning to fidget in your chairs and things like that. So that's one way of making sure that we have time for question and answers. So Juan Pablo.
Thank you very much, Arvid. First of all, let me thank to the Program of Economic Policy Management to invite me to this conference celebrating its 20th anniversary. It's a great honor for me to be part of this celebration. Thank you. In fact, I am part of the PEPM family since 1998, when I came here as a new PEPM student. In those days, Francisco, Maya, Deborah welcomed us. Then since 2002, I started to teach some lectures about fiscal issues as also in the PEPM. That's made me feel like a part of the PEPM family. Since Guillermo, Arvid, and David invited me to this conference, I changed my feelings. I passed through different feelings. In the first moment, I felt very happy. Then, when I saw the program of the conference and the other members of the table, I felt very nervous. Almost sick. So, finally, I start to imagine what to say here with some value added. So I am the only former PEPM student in the table. So that's for me, it's a value added. And this characteristic will mark my presentation. In my presentation, I propose you to visit together some of the economic facts that I consider the most important in the last 20 years in the region. I better know that is Latin America. My presentation will take a former PEPM student point of view with an additional touch of public finance professor and some flavor of Latin American countries' regional organization staff. In 1992, when the PEPM was created, I had finished my bachelor in economics in the University of Buenos Aires and started to work in the Ministry of Economy. So I also have 20 years of economic policy management, so experience. So let me... in those days, 2002, when the PEPM was created, the inflation were well beyond, as you can see, of the limits of the figure that I present. We were returning from a high flight to the inflation heights. After the hyperinflation experience and returning to live with a low tax rate, we need to readapt our practice in several aspects of our lives. In those days, in my new position in the Ministry of Economy, in the Fiscal Analysis Division, a new period was starting. We had to learn again how to prepare the public budget and estimate tax revenues with a normal inflation rate. The budget preparation and tax forecast become to be useful economic tools and not only an instrument to approve new public expenditure, as it was before. So the first key economic issue that I want to emphasize here is the decrease of nominal volatility. In 1998, I applied to the PEPM. My motivation to come here was not only to live some months in New York and listen to jazz concert and see the Knicks. Remember that in those days the Knicks played the playoff in those days. But also and fundamentally to understand how we could improve the result of public sector intervention with a significant financial and fiscal restriction. The usual fiscal position in Latin America in those days could be characterized by high fiscal deficit and high public debt ratio. Scarcity was the name of the game, and the traditional characterization of the fiscal policy was a procyclical behavior. After that, and fundamentally since 2002, after my return to Latin America and when I start to teach some classes about fiscal issues in the PEPM, Latin America countries began to improve its fiscal performance. The region scored some unusual fiscal achievements. The low inflation rate and economic growth translated into higher revenue levels. This trend was more important still in the countries that were specialized in natural resources. More significant, however, was the authorities' management of public spending during this situation. The fiscal performance in 2003-2008 has differed from other boom periods because the regions took advantage of the positive economic condition to sustain their fiscal position. So the country's governments avoided expansionary fiscal policies and instead opted to use the growth phase to build up their primary surpluses and pay down their debt. In addition to also lowering their external vulnerability, this gave fiscal policy makers more room of more fiscal space. In other words, unlike what has usually occurred during past periods of economic growth, public expenditure has not followed the upturn in fiscal revenues. In some way, the dynamic of public expenditure was a disconnect of the improvement of fiscal revenues. As one example of this change, in our course of fiscal issues in the PEPM, in the last years, we start to discuss how to manage the increase in fiscal resources using, for example, stabilization and saving funds, multi-annual budget, this kind of thing that were absolutely strange years ago. So the second economic policy success that I want to emphasize here is the fiscal consolidation and the decrease of external vulnerabilities. The third is that I want to emphasize is the huge improvement in the poverty rate. But as we have a time restriction, I'm going to pass to the fourth issue that maybe is more challenging and is related with this third. What I consider the most important challenge that Latin America has faced in the last decades is how to fill the empty box. Nearly 2 decades ago, an eclectic economist, Fernando Feinsilber, had a simple but very deep idea for me. He constructed a double entry table for use to classify all the countries of Latin America in terms of their performance, in terms of income concentration and growth rates. When it was complete, only one of the 4 boxes in that table remained empty. And that was the one that combined high growth with low levels of inequality. Since those days, the idea of the empty box is used as a metaphor for the region's shortcomings in growth and income distribution, which continue to be a challenge for analysts and policymakers until nowadays. So in the graph, the empty box is the box where the GDP increased and the inequality decreased. Only in the last period, we can observe an important number of countries that registered a significant, between 2005 and 2010, that registered a significant decrease of inequality with an important growth. Very unusual for the region, but the challenge is still there. Latin America is still the most unequal region in the world. I'm going to stop here. These are the 4 facts that I want to emphasize in this presentation. Thanks again for the invitation and for your patience.
Well, I'm Michael Connelly, and I'd like to thank Michael Gavin for inviting me to substitute for him as the director of PEPM. Michael Gavin, who's here, was the first director of PEPM and laid the framework for the PEPM program. And I'd also like to thank Professors Mundell and Professors Findlay for being such good hosts while I spent the 2 years here. And I enjoyed very much the PEPM program, found it exciting, and I'm glad to stay in touch with you. Now, I won't speak for very long because my former professor, Robert Mundell, is in the room today. And the less I speak, the more likely it is I won't make any mistakes. We are all scared of our former professors, so if you notice him fidgeting, please let me know. Now, I've stayed in touch with PEPM because PEPM, New York, Columbia, has spawned programs in France and now in Africa. And in particular, I teach once a year in the PEPM program, which is Gestion de Politique Économique in French, in the Ivory Coast. And this is a picture of the students, your colleagues in Abidjan, and they are from around West Africa. It's a global program. It doesn't draw only on Ivorian students. And I learn a great deal there, and I enjoy very much returning there. After the War of Succession ended this July, they invited me to join them in August. I was in France on my vacation, but anxious to visit Abidjan right after this terrible war took place regarding the succession in the election. So I had a chance to see Abidjan and some of the universities which were devastated during the actions in Abidjan. Now, one thing I love to do, especially in Abidjan, is to assign a topic and have the students do the presentation. So this is the solo growth model, and this is one of the students that is presenting and solving numerically the solo growth model. So I think one of the principles of PEPM has always been to enable and to empower and to give the tools that students can use later on, ways of thinking, not just platitudes. Now, I thought that it would be useful to address the topic of the session, and that is, what are the key issues in the last 20 years? And I always have a knee-jerk reaction. I like to talk about Laffer curves. And here's one that I think is particularly important and relevant today, and this is the role of government in growth, according to Robert Barrow. And in particular, government spending can play a major role in raising growth or in reducing growth. Indeed, there is an optimal size of government depending on its contribution as an input to economic growth. This is the simplified Cobb-Douglas production function. Y is output per worker, A is technology, K is capital per worker, G is government spending per worker. And so there are constant returns to scale so that as K and G expand in the same proportion, output expands in the same proportion. So using this simple production function, the coefficient alpha represents the elasticity of GDP, real GDP, with respect to an extra dollar spent on another worker. With a balanced budget constraint, G is equal to tau times Y in the Barrow model. In other words, we have a flat or a proportional tax. The size of government that maximizes the growth rate, gamma, is given by alpha, which is simply the elasticity of income per worker with respect to government spending per worker. What I like very much about the Barrow model is it's not theology nor conviction. It's a technical concept that relates to productivity. Productive governments should enjoy a larger share in their economies, whereas unproductive governments should enjoy a smaller share. So this is the Laffer curve, which I promised earlier. The lower line, black solid line, is using that production function, and when government spending is zero, you have anarchy and warlords looting the country and stealing wealth. So growth is negative when you have no government. When government confiscates, that's at the very far left, when government taxes 100%, in other words, is totally confiscatory, once again, you have negative growth. Thus, if there's a continuous line between these 2 points or crossing zero, we must have some level of government spending which maximizes real economic growth. And so this is the diagram from Barrow's important article showing that the size of government in this particular case, since the coefficient alpha is 0.25, the government spending should be 25% of GDP. Now, Barrow did some regressions and found that, in fact, when government spending is mainly on what is called government consumption, this tends to inhibit growth in a significant fashion. The coefficient is not large, but it's highly significant. It's negative and significant. So that the suggestion is empirically government consumption spending or transfers and entitlements are not likely to lead to more rapid growth. In fact, they're likely to lead to lower growth. Public infrastructure investment does not inhibit growth. Now, this I thought I would put up to sort of address this issue of the Ivory Coast. Now, one of the wonderful things they have in Africa, even though there are great divisions, is within each country there are tremendous soccer fans. And when the Africa Cup takes place, it is so exciting to be in Africa. And I was there during the Africa Cup and ran across my friend Mamba here, who had the wisdom of trading his cell phone for this wonderful mask. And I have a cell phone, so if anyone here has a mask like that, I'd like to trade it to you for the mask. Thank you.
Well, I won't have any pretty pictures. It's awesome, two wonderful presentations. Just a little comment about Mike's optimum size of government. It turns out at 25%, according to the Barrow's model in the assumptions made. But something like 70 years ago, Colin Clark came up with the idea that the maximum government spending and taxation in an economy, the maximum taxable that can efficiently get is 25%. So now, of course, all our economies have gone way beyond that, most of them anyway. Europe has gone up toward 50% and can't afford it because they can't balance budgets at that level of spending, and they're in this impossible debt situation, which the title of this ingenious title of this seminar is Key Economic Policy Issues in the Past 20 Years. What an awesome title to think of. And there's so many issues that have come up. One of those is what I just started with, the level of government spending and the runaway levels of debt. not just in Europe, which is in the forefront of it now, but in the United States, in California, in Illinois, and in Japan, and a host of other countries. So it's a problem that comes in, and it's very easy to understand why it comes in. And I think when it comes about, it's most rampant in democracies. And it may be that there's some negative aspects of democracies that have to be taken into account and allowed for in constitutions that would curb democracies from doing bad things. Because if you take any of the big issues of government spending, the government's people in the current government love the benefits of government spending, whether they're for pensions or anything like that. The government gets applause, but it's the debt that clicks in later on to future governments. So there's a myopia in governments in facing the electorates. They overcharge, and this is true with both Democratic and Republican governments in the United States. Certainly, I think the Bush administration overspent very much, and now the current administration is overspending. And all of Europe has done that in spades, running up the public debt. Well, Greece, of course, is colossal, but even Italy is still 120% of GDP when it was that before they entered the Eurozone. It was already 120% of GDP, and while they should have been working that down to a feasible level, they didn't do it. And so they're struck with the calamity that Europe is facing now with respect to the debts. And that, of course, is one of the big key policy issues right currently is what does this mean for the euro? Now, there's a large body of opinion you hear, particularly on this side of the Atlantic, that suggests that the euro is going to go down because of the debt situation. But I don't believe that's the case, because there's no advantage to any of the countries to leave the Eurozone. And Europe has, as the Merkel and Sarkozy and others have said, the euro is the primary policy of the European Union. And this is, and they say, without the euro, if that euro area broke up, the European Union wouldn't have that glue that sticks it together in the way it does in Germany and France and the leadership of it at the present time. So I myself don't think that there will be any countries leaving the euro area. It's better if they have to default, and practically some of the countries have already defaulted, but restructuring has been used instead of saying default. That it's better to default inside the euro area and within the euro system than it is to leave it and set back Greece and those other countries another couple of decades before they could come back in to reign again. Now, the euro is itself a very important. The creation of the euro was an important policy issue of the last 20 years, and the Delors report was 1989, and then the Maastricht Treaty 1991, and then the European monetary, the creation of the euro in 1999, and so on. Now, is that a good idea or not? How important is it? Well, I think it's very important, probably more important than most people think. Not because of the effect it may have on the immediate working of the system, but because it changes the power configuration of the international monetary system in a very big way. If you look at the 20th century, of the monetary history of the 20th century, it was a history of the gold standard up until 1913, 1914. And then something really big happened. You're going to think World War I. But it was the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And this was the most important monetary event of the 20th century, because the creation of the Federal Reserve System, giving the central bank, a central bank to a country that was bigger than the next three biggest economies put together, bigger than Britain, Germany, and France put together, the economy. Giving that a central bank gave the United States the power to control and destroy or manage in some way the gold standard. and that turned out to be badly managed, and it was broke down, and it went back, and it broke down again, and then we got into a Bretton Woods system, which was ultimately allowed for the superpower of the dollar in the system. But the gold exchange standard part of that broke down in 1971 because there was no mechanism in the Bretton Woods system for curbing inflation. The U.S. followed a policy for the American economy, not for maintaining the equilibrium in the gold market. So the U.S. lost they had 70% of the world's monetary gold stock in 1948. In 1971, they had 30% of it, only 300 million ounces of gold instead of 700 million ounces. And that's more or less the way it's got stuck now with the distribution of gold around the world. Now, what the euro did was the dollar for most of the 20th century was the mainstream of the world economy, in the sense that if any country fixed their currencies to the dollar, they'd be fixing their currencies, period, because the U.S. represented the mainstream of the world economy. That was certainly true in the Bretton Woods period before 1971. It got to be a little less true in the late 1970s. And then in 1978-79, the European monetary system was created. The U.S. sponsored and pushed countries onto flexible exchange rates. And the IMF was trying to get countries to to flex their exchange rates. Well, Europe was going in the other direction because they hated flexible exchange rates, and they moved to creating their own monetary system, and it took a long time for it to happen, but they got it in 1999. Now, what that did was a great thing for Europe, but it created a problem for the world economy because there was no longer an anchor currency out there that was that a small country or a medium-sized country could fix to and still have stability of its exchange rates because of the big swings in the dollar-euro exchange rate. So there was no euro before 1999, but there was the European Currency Unit, the ECU, and you can track that ECU and euro back to 1970. That weighted average of the European currencies. And so you had big swings of policy, very expansionary monetary policies in the United States in the late 1970s, depreciating dollar. It's when the oil prices went up and the price of gold went up to from $100 to $850 an ounce. And then tight money after Reagan came in and Paul Volcker started to tighten and to correct the mistakes he'd made in the first 2 years, or 2 years of too much inflation. Then there was a very sharp tight cutting back, and the dollar soared. It doubled against the Deutschmark, just as in the previous decade it halved against the Deutschmark. And then you had the Plaza Accord, and the dollar talked down and so on. So now the bottom line of what I'm saying here is that then now the euro added that break that split the world economy into two parts, the monetary system into a dollar-based system and a euro-based system. Two big halves. And you have big swings up and down in the dollar, and every time you have those dollar-euro rate, every time you have those, you have a big crisis. The most recent crisis is one that most people miss. You know, Congress came out with an evaluation of what was the cause of the big crisis in October 2008. And they come out with 10 reasons for it. So 10 reasons is like no reasons. 100 reasons would be even weaker. But the reason for why the crisis struck at that time, and it wasn't even exactly a subprime mortgage crisis, it was a sudden reversal of the dollar-euro exchange rate, because the dollar soared by 30% from June to October of 2008. The euro was $1.64 in June 2008, and in October 23, it was $1.23. That's more than a 30% appreciation of the dollar over that period. Over that period, the price of gold plummeted from $980 to $720. And the price of Oil, which had reached a all-time high of $148, went down to $33. And the U.S. price level, the index of prices, was 5.5% annualized in June '08. By the end of the year, it had been 0. And in March, it was minus 2%. And it was that for the rest of until June. Suddenly, the Federal Reserve woke up and said, oh, our inflation rate isn't as high as it should be. It's lower. There was deflation in the U.S. in the period. And this is what broke apart the whole U.S. economy, that reversal of monetary policy. So it's one of the big issues of the world economy. Now, when I started, I had the thought of these different things. I was going to talk about global imbalances and the currency problems, appreciation of China or not, and reform of the international monetary system, Federal Reserve monetary policy. I did talk about that, the European debt crisis, the theory of optimum currency areas. How you now, with no international monetary system, what do countries in Africa do? For the first time, these countries there's no anchor in the world economy. My quick solution to this would be to reform the international monetary system, and you have to do it by having a global currency. Paul Volcker is a big sponsor, head of the Federal Reserve, former head, chairman of the Fed. He says the global economy needs a global currency. And I think you do, but there's only one way you could get it. There's no way. You can't go back to use gold again. It's not going to be acceptable or useful at this time. It wouldn't work anymore. The dollar isn't going to work anymore by itself, but the dollar and the euro together, joined together with a fixed rate between them, with a euro dollar that was fixed, would represent 40% of the world economy and represent a good anchor for the world economy. And then add China to it, and China will add another 10%, so you'd have 50% of the world economy if you could fix two exchange rates. And China loves to keep its exchange rate fixed to the dollar, so that's not a problem. It's only the problem of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. But the Europeans aren't really the problem. The real problem rests in the Treasury and the Federal Reserve System. I made this proposal in Nanjing, China. And it was before quite a good audience, almost as good as this one. Secretary of the Treasury Geithner came up to me afterwards, and I had these diagrams up, and he was very interested in this idea of linking the dollar, the euro, and Chinese currency together. But of course, it's a long way before any kind of economic policy in this political world like that would come as a proposal for the United States. But as long as there are big swings in the dollar-euro rate, you cannot have an international monetary system. So then you lapse into monetary nationalism, and you get all the defects of that problem. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bob, Michael, and Juan Pablo for those excellent presentations. We do, in fact, have, remarkably, time left for questions. So when you step up to the mic David is going to hand it to you. Please do mention your name, if you were part of PEPM, what year, and if not, what your affiliation is. Thank you, and who the question is for.
Hi, good morning. Alberto Ergoni, PEPM of 2006. I have a question for Professor Connelly. So I got your point about, the optimal size of the government. Theoretically speaking, how do you explain the case of the northern countries in Europe where they have an astonishing tax rate, a big size of the government, and then they are growing? So they are among the best countries in the world. So people apparently are doing quite well. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, yes. On the one hand, there are resources like petroleum that help finance that prosperity. There's, secondly, the rule of law is very strong, and there's a social contract in those places. And thirdly, the governments are less prone to corruption, as all indices show. So I think it's a little bit of a different issue. Nevertheless, fundamentally, it's the same one. But due to their social contract, strong rule of law, and their resources, I think they've managed to do very well, but not remarkably well. I don't think their growth rates are nevertheless that high. Norway, for instance, may have higher GDP per capita than the US, but by and large, they're pretty much the same. If you take Sweden, that probably is a counterexample, where their taxes and government spending became much too high, were reducing incentives and encouraging people to lay in the social safety hammock, as it was put by some Swedish economists. So if you take Sweden in particular, that would be a counterexample to any high growth story with a high government sector. Now sometimes, and I'll stop there, sometimes there's just an accounting issue, because government spending is counted at cost as a contribution to GDP. So that in many cases when you see expanding or increasing GDP, it may be accounted for by increased government spending. But it may be short-lived, and it may, in fact, lower long-run growth. I can recall in Peru when Pablo Garcia defaulted and spent like crazy, Keynesian style. Real GDP was growing 8-9%, but ultimately it collapsed and growth became negative. So I think the key thing is to think of long-term growth, not the level of GDP. And there is an optimal size for each nation. And it may involve higher government involvement in countries that have very strong rule of law, strong social contracts, and honest politicians. It's kind of like the unicorn. It's hard to find them, but...
Yes, sir.
Frans Verhagen of the International Institute of Monetary Transformation. Not reform, but transformation. And an MIA of 1973. And my question is a kind of involved one, both for Professor Connelly and for Professor Mondell. I suppose many of us are in favor of lesser volatility and in exchange rate, less currency manipulation and speculation. Some of us might even be in favor of removal of global reserves, which cost developing countries about 100 billion a year. And the solution that Professor Mondell was proposing makes sense. But I think it's an intermediate proposal. I would go one step further, and that's basically my question. Should we not start thinking in a creative way of developing a monetary standard that is really adapted and responds to the major 21st century policy problems? And I'm particularly thinking in terms of the climate crisis. So why not have a carbon standard of a very specific tonnage of CO2e per person? Thank you.
didn't quite understand what your plan was. Is it a private standard? What kind?
It's a commodity standard.
Oh,
Standard.
I see. Well, if you have a commodity standard when you have barter. In a barter economy, you have a commodity standard. If gold is always worth the same as a commodity as it is as a money, it's not really a monetary standard, it's a commodity standard. Well, you get money when currencies are overvalued. That's the basic idea. So a commodity standard would be, well, you know, there have been authoritative people in the past who've advocated them. Graham and Whittlesey did this, and there's been one plan after the other. Every decade or so, there's an idea come forward. But it's a very complicated standard to work. It's not efficient. It's not use gold. Gold was much better because gold was itself something that is liquid and can be and was stable against commodities on the average, or not too unstable against it, the other commodities. But I don't see how you can ever work in the world today, or ever have any. Who would manage it? Who would construct such a thing? You remember, you're living in a world where there's no world government. If there was a world government, you could have an overvalued global currency established by the world government, but you can't have that today. You can't use gold today by itself because gold, if it's not monetized, is unstable. Now it's the only thing that gave gold stability in the past 60 years, or in the Bretton Woods system, was the fact that the U.S. was fixing it. But if you had a dollar, U.S. no longer can't fix gold anymore. It can't do what it did in 1934 and be the standard. It wouldn't work to do what the president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, proposed. Have another Bretton Woods system with a new price of gold fixed. It wouldn't, because the U.S. has only got 30% of the stock now. Europe has got 60%. So it has to be with Europe and the United States if you're going to put gold into it. But the first step would be to stabilize, at least within a band, the dollar-euro rate, because these are the two major units of account in the system, accounting for so much more than anything else. And then after that, you could let gold trail along, stabilized against it, and have maybe some kind of convertibility in it, but it would not be the operative part of the system. It couldn't be anymore.
Michael, did you want to comment as well?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right, great. Okay. Well, actually, we'll go on for another question. Right here. Thank you. Please.
Hi. My name is Joseph Brady Amoon. I'm an EMPA from O2. My question is, what would growth rates look like in the U.S. and in Western society if government limited its take to a total of 25%?
Michael, I think that's you.
Government
Well, let's go. To keep it simple, go from steady state to steady state and not talk about the transition. Okay?
This is an economist speaking. We'll assume away the...
Yeah. In the steady state, yes. Growth would be substantially higher. If you look at the French and the sort of the Euro malaise, slow growth, big government, slow growth, big government, slow growth. We're doing that. We're moving in that direction now. To conceive of the steady states, 25% government spending, that should be enough, frankly. Fix potholes, defend, have police, judicial system. That's plenty. But growth would be easily 6-7%. I mean, we're stumbling along at 2%, and we'll continue to stumble along at 2% at best, the way things are being spent now. And I mean, this model leads to really interesting expansions. For example, the Sargent and Wallace, some unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. In the U.S. currently, mandated expenditure is barely covered by total taxes. So this is, in principle, well, it is a policy instrument if you're willing to change the law, because entitlements are so great that they can only be reformed through the democratic process of increasing the retirement age, reducing compensation for this, making disability insurance more difficult. But if you could do that and conceive of two steady states, the growth rate would be very, very high. But I really can't address the question of how do you get there from here, where spending is maybe 35% of GDP, and in Europe 45%. Getting from here to there will be difficult and will also require changing the laws, because we have given so many entitlements that we can't even tax enough to pay for them.
Well, I think one of the concerns with lowering government spending might be that redistributive policies would be eliminated, and given income trends in the United States and other countries, there might be quite a bit of pushback about that. And Juan Pablo, in your presentation, you discussed the concept of growth with equity, and I thought perhaps you might want to comment on this issue as well.
Actually, I came from a region that the average tax rate is 18%. So we are not close not close from the 25 and not close from 35. So that's and that's in some countries is a huge problem. Not to growth, also to guarantee the life of some for security. You know, Guatemala have 10% of GDP. It's impossible to. So that's but I think that I'm not going, but the relation. I think that you have a good point. The relationship between size of government and redistribution is well, we have to revisit it in our theory, at least. But of course, my examples are far from the optimal tax rate that we discuss in the table.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Eric Michel Soussouglo. I'm a PEPM of 04. My question is for both Professor Connelly and Mondale. Do you think that emerging market that would peg their currencies to the hypothetic new euro and dollar standard, is it going to hurt the economy in the sense of the trade account balance, or is it going to give them a boost and some stability in terms of inflation, or what's going to be the economic consequences of some of the emerging countries pegging their currency, to that hypothetic standards? I'm asking the question because currently, as you know, West African countries are pegged to the euro by a fixed exchange rate. Yes. So that's why I want to know that. What do you think?
Do you want to take that?
You start. No.
Oh.
Good job.
Yes. Well, the West African Monetary Union and the East African franc, the CFA franc, has been around for a long time, and it's a modified currency board system, so the central banks of these 14 countries cannot print money. So the French Treasury requires them to hold 60% of their operational balances with the French Treasury, and these CFA francs they cannot finance more than 20% of the public deficit. I think this is a recipe for stability to remove the exchange rate issue and uncertainty regarding the fiscal deficit and printing press finance of the fiscal deficit by removing it from the equation. So having a common currency, I think, is always, not only does it save on conversion expenses, but you don't have to worry about risk management, currency risk management, because volatility is zero, so options have zero value. So it's if you take away the risk of unfortunate monetary policies, you're laying a good foundation for the real economy to grow. Now, there's a very interesting example in this recent civil war in the Ivory Coast. The incumbent president, Laurent Gbagbo, had to pay his troops to defend against Alassane Ouattara's troops, the rebel troops from the north. He had won the election, but Gbagbo declared himself the winner, and he was paying the army to defend his position. Well, the West African Monetary Union cut him off. He made one draw and gave his army about a month or two of salary, and then they said, sorry, no more money. Now, he couldn't print money, so I think this was, it led, in fact, to his losing out to not only, of course, Ouattara's rebel troops, but also the French Foreign Legion that was there and the UN peacekeepers who supported the newly elected president. So it was very fortunate that in that particular case, Gbagbo could not print up banknotes to give to his soldiers to defend his regime. So in that particular case, I think it led to stability, but you can't, there's a friend of mine said to me years ago, you just can't eat paper, you can't eat money. It doesn't produce real goods. So if you remove monetary instability from the equation with a common currency, then I think that's of great benefit. And I support Professor Mundel's arguments for a common currency whenever and wherever he makes them, yeah.
Well, I was in Africa in 1970 as for the sort of one-man commissioner, Economic Commission for Africa, to go around the African countries and to discuss the effects of the French and British devaluations in 1967, 1968 on Francophone and Anglophone countries. And it was a wonderful, interesting experiment to go around to these different countries and see the big effects that those devaluations had. Today, the world it's what I was saying earlier, that it's a terrible thing for Africa, not inside the dark Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Northern Africa, and the Middle East. A terrible thing. Big swings in the dollar-euro exchange rate, because these countries, many of them are dollar-related, many of them are Europe-related. Fortunately, I think more are euro-related than dollar-related. And so the fixing of the Western countries to the Eurozone would be, in terms of the euro, fixing their currencies to the euro is a better deal than fixing to the dollar. I think that's the case. Yet these swings are enormous. Just as for all the dollar countries, in 1990s, every country that fixed to the dollar country in late 1990s, when the dollar was appreciating, with the Silicon Valley IT revolution, the U.S. growth rate had almost doubled in the late 90s. All countries had deflation, including China, for the first time in decades, in a century, had some deflation. in late 1990s. Every country tied to the dollar had deflation. Panama had deflation. All the Gulf states were tied to the dollar had deflation. Kazakhstan and the Georgia and those countries that were tied to the dollar all had deflation. And then after the 2001 recession and the expansionary monetary policy in the U.S., the dollar went down in that period. All those countries had too much inflation up until the summer of 2008. And they were all getting lots of reserves, and they all thought, maybe they should appreciate against the dollar. And Alan Greenspan went to Saudi Arabia and said, you should appreciate against the dollar to get rid of inflation. This was in April 1997. It would have been disastrous because 2 months later, the U.S. started to tighten. And the dollar soared by 30%, and it almost bankrupted those countries, some of them like the Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, and all those countries. And all those countries this time tied to the dollar, including Kazakhstan, Georgia. I went to visit those afterwards. They all had about a 20% devaluation at some point, and then started to restore themselves. And Canada I've always believed that Canada would be better off with a stable fixed exchange rate with the U.S. or some kind of monetary union. Anyway, a fixed rate. But in this crisis, I decided no, Canada was better off having a flexible rate because, the dollar was soaring by 30% in that tragic summer of 2008, the Canadian dollar could depreciate. And it escaped. Canada didn't have the big financial crisis that the United States did. People said it's because the Canadian banks are better than the American banks. Well, it's probably true because America has 50 banking systems, and Canada has only one. And they have bigger banks and so on. So I think the banking system, but that wasn't the reason. The reason why Canada escaped the Great Recession that the U.S. had was because the Canadian dollar was able to depreciate over that period. So I think that because American monetary policy has become unstable, the things that the Fed looks at are no longer what they should be looking at in judging American monetary policy. Some of you may have read all these books about the Fed and everything in Fed We Trust, and books about the Bernanke's Dashboard, the book by the an editor of the Wall Street Journal, very, very good book, talks about Bernanke's dashboard, and he lists 5 things on it. He doesn't have the dollar-euro rate on it, and he doesn't have the price of gold on it. He's got the market cap of Citibank, and that's one of the 5 things he looked at. Of course, that was going down from $350 billion down to $40 billion. Tragic collapse and bankruptcy of Citibank and General Motors, and General Motors went bankrupt, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac went bankrupt, were bailed out, and then Lehman Brothers, of course, went bankrupt, and you had this great crash. All through this, the Fed was tightening all through that period. In the middle of a recession, a soaring dollar in the middle of a recession. It's just shocking. Look, the Fed needs to start to think again about what it looks at, and it's a terrible monetary policy. In Europe, suddenly, we've got a new leaf. Europe has got a good central banker, a really good central banker, Mario Draghi, and he saved the European system from cracking up by 2 big issues of these long-term retros, as I call them, in about $1 trillion worth in the last 6 months, and that averted a big financial crisis in Europe. But the Americans' banking system, they're like, it's as if they were following the same monetary policy as under the Bretton Woods period, when there was a fixed exchange rate. And now the exchange rate is a key factor in policy, but they don't take that into account. They don't even look at it. It's not on his dashboard.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, Michael, Juan Pablo, for a very stimulating discussion and set of presentations. And thanks to the audience for great questions and for your attention. I regret we have to close things up now because lunch is scheduled on the third floor for 1 o'clock, and it is now almost 1 o'clock. So thank you again for coming, and thank you.
Wow, spectacular. That was good.